Hello everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Paul D'Ambrosio, and I teach Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University, where the 四海为学collaborative learning project is based. I want to welcome you all to our 36th lecture and our 72nd event since 2022. Today we are hosting Professor Mara Yue, who will give a talk on rethinking late Qing and Republican constitutionalism through global history, tradition, and modernity. Joining us today, we have a number of invited discussants here to talk. We have Professor Philippe Major from Lancaster University, Professor Fan Xin from Shanghai Tech University, and Professor Anna Baka of Charles University in Prague, where it is currently snowing, apparently. Our chair today is Siyu from East China Normal University. And it has become a tradition here at 四海为学 to give younger scholars a chance to be part of high-profile academic events by inviting them to take part as chairs or discussants. So if there are any younger scholars in the audience who wish to be part of a future event, please email me. This event today will be 90 minutes in total, ending promptly at 9:30 Beijing time. Before getting started and handing things over to Siyu, I want to say a few things about the 四海为学collaborative learning project. This project hopes to distinguish itself from some of the less productive conventional practices sometimes found in contemporary academia. As posted on our website, we are not interested in male peacocks, in jerks, or in any form of egoism or self-promotion. We hope to curb all types of aggressive and "look at me, I'm smarter than you," or "don't I know so much," and similar attitudes sometimes found in academic exchanges. We might even go so far as to say that we hope to be somewhat of a counterbalance for the negative attitudes sometimes found in so-called blind reviews. While there is certainly a time and a place for anonymity, or at least the appearance of anonymity, communication in academia should have just as much time and place for speaking to one another on more congenial and community-forming settings. The neologism 四海为学, which was created by Robin Wong, is a play on 四海为家, and we hope to keep this idea of 四海为家at the foreground of all of our events. The 四海为学collaborative learning project seeks to accomplish these shifts in orientation during academic exchange by encouraging humble discussions, real questions, and responses that are open and honest. We hope to foster environments where people truly learn from and with one another. So, before introducing our chair, I would like to once again thank everyone for being here, especially Professor Mora and the invited discussants. Our chair today is Siyu. She is a PhD student at East China Normal University, and her research interests lie in ethics, with a particular attention to the Somerville Quartet, especially Iris Murdoch and Elizabeth Anscombe. She is also interested in Chinese philosophy and animal ethics, and is currently working to explore what Confucian traditions might contribute to debates in contemporary animal ethics. It is very nice to have you here with us today, Siyu. The screen is yours. Oh, you're still muted, Siyu. Oh, Siyu, we still can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Sorry. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Mara Yue is an associate professor of history at Cornell University. Her research centers on imperial and modern China, with particular interests in law, state building, and China's global connections. She is the author of State and Family in China, Filial Piety and its Modern Reform, and defining China from dynastic state to People's Republic. She is currently working on two book projects, one on US-China relations through the intertwined lives of six trans-Pacific travelers, and another on political legitimation in Chinese history across the ages. Title of her talk today is Rethinking Late Qing and Republic and Constitutionalism Through Global History, Tradition and Modernity. Please give a warm welcome to Mara.
Thank you. So I will start. Can you hear me? Okay, good. So before diving into the details of my presentation, which is based on my forthcoming book from Columbia University Press, please allow me to first express my sincere gratitude to Professor Paul D'Ambrosio at East China Normal University for giving me this opportunity to share my research at 四海为学. I also want to thank Siyu for being the moderator and Professor and Baka, Professor Xin Fan, and Professor Philippe Major for commenting on this talk and on my larger project. I also want to thank all of you in the audience for being here today. In the past few years, I have been making efforts to present with more grace and try to speak slowly to allow the audience to better process the information. My efforts have achieved only limited success. In the next 15 minutes or so, the presentation will follow one of the two main narrative arcs of my book manuscript, which is currently under copy editing. To save more time for discussion, I will skip some slides and will not be able to orally translate or give detailed explanations on the information you can get by reading the quotes on the slides. Hopefully, this presentation serves as a good point of departure for our conversation. My current book project, Defining China from Dynastic State to People's Republic, studies how China and transnationalism have been shaped by the multifaceted concept Guo, which means a dynastic state in classical Chinese, but which came to be used to represent the modern nation state since the late 19th century. Growing up in China, I was educated that the rise and fall of the country or nation or 国家 is the responsibility of every single man. Even when 天下 or all under heaven is used in contemporary China in the place of 国家 in this sentence, it means the 国 Chinese citizens are supposed to love, or the People's Republic of China. This 国 is represented by the 5-star red flag on this flyer promoting patriotism or 爱国主义, literally is about the love of the 国, as in this socialist core value campaign flyer, right? But the pre-modernist in me questions this modern appropriation of a piece of writing that was created during the Ming-Qing transition in the 17th century. Here is the original by Huang Zongxi. There is a loss of 国 and the loss of 天下 all under heaven. How do they differ? A change of dynastic title and the surname of the ruling household is called the loss of 国. If humaneness and righteousness, 仁义, are blocked to the extent that the state or ruler leaves beasts to eat people, or that the people eat each other, that is a loss of all under heaven. Protecting the 国 is the business of the ruler and the officials who have vested interest in the 国. Protecting all under heaven is the responsibility of every single man. I'm also troubled something must have happened between Huang Zongxi's time and today that changed the meaning of 国, 国家 in China and in the Chinese language from a dynastic state. 国's classical meaning that warranties the efforts of ruler and ruling classes to preserve it to a nation state, albeit with a strong emphasis on the ruling regime that every citizen is expected to care about. I'm also troubled by the whole narrative of China. We grew up being an old civilizational country, 文明古国, but the United States, where I live, as a young country, or 年轻的国家. It seems that many people on both sides of the Pacific, including political leaders and whoever in charge of composing and translating official documents, also accept this categorization. At the same time, the Chinese government often sends out completely opposite messages, such as in the photo showing Wang Yi, the PRC's current diplomacy czar, participated in 2024 in the celebration of the establishment of US-China diplomatic relations. 中美建交 for 45 years. This means China is a young country. Wang did not seem to perceive diplomatic relations between the United States and the Qing or the Republic of China as Sino-US relations. Obviously, the multifaceted meaning of Guo does not lose its relevance up to today. The Chinese notion Guo, which was and still is the locus of Chinese sovereignty, serves as an anchor of this project, through tracing the entanglement between the evolving global order and sovereign notions in China. This book tells two stories about China that were intimately related to each other. The first storyline is a conceptual history of Guo over China's long 20th century. China evolved from a nationless state of the imperial times to an aspiring ethno-civic nation under the Republic of China during the first half of the 20th century, and then to a nation defined by the state under the People's Republic of China after 1949. At the same time, the relationship between Guo, nation-state country regime, and me, people, also changed in conception, if not always in practice. In a sense, the first storyline concerns the tension between the two definitions of Guo. The first definition was introduced by the American missionary W.A.P. Martin's 1864 translation of Henry Wheaton's Elements of International Law. I'll quote here. A Guo being a Guo because it was of the same root. A Guo remains the same as long as its people remain. 其民尚存而其国无异. Here, the imported modern notion of Guo carried and still carries the baggage of the Latin or Roman language root of nation, meaning a collectivity of people, however defined. Dynastic form or regime change matters very little for China or for any other country under this definition. The second definition was the classical meaning of Guo in Chinese as broadly defined dynastic regime or polity ruling over a particular realm. According to this definition, the Great Qing state was a different Guo than the Great Ming state. The founding of the People's Republic of China can be described as establishment of a country, 建国, and the Republic of China was an enemy country for Qing loyalists and for the People's Republic of China alike. It is this indigenous definition of Guo that led Wang Yi to perceive Sino-US relations as starting from 1979, and this time-honored definition of Guo led many in China to describe the PRC as a completely new country, 崭新的国家. Reading a pre-modern and Chinese concept Guo into the modern era, rather than reading the modern concept nation back into history, this narrative thread enables this book to highlight division and incomparability in global interconnectedness. It also prompts me to engage with methodological issues in global history, which is discussed in detail in the epilogue. Word and worldviews, rethinking globalization across time and space. The second intertwined storyline of my book concerns the intersection between the broadly defined Chinese mainland and broadly defined maritime China. It shows how the ethnic and civic aspects of modern nationalism were introduced to China together by Chinese overseas and the transnational intellectuals in the late Qing and the Republican periods. For those transnational Chinese, remaking China according to their vision was a means through which they fought against legalized racism that was spreading quickly from the United States to the Asia Pacific at the turn of the 20th century. These transnational Chinese also sought to preserve Chinese civilizational essence in Confucianism, which they saw as agreeing with rather than conflicting with liberal nationalism as expressed in liberty, equality, fraternity, or in of the people, by the people, and for the people, symbolized by the blue, white, red tricolor. This storyline ends with how Guo or Guojia as a regime or dynastic state broadly defined in the form of a communist party state made a triumphant return in China after 1949 in a symbiotic relationship with the imperial era legalist statism. This thread is what today's presentation focuses on. Chapter 1 traces the etymological root of Guo as a hereditary dynastic state in pre-modern China, manifested in the evolving assessment in political discourse and in popular culture of the paragon of loyalty, the medieval general Yue Fei, and the Song Yuanming and Qing dynasties in 20th century China and up to present. Chapter 2 looks at the interaction between the Euro-American dominated international order and the traditional Chinese worldview during the second half of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th century. Diplomatic engagement led to an intellectual revolution, changing the notion of Guo from a dynastic state, a regime distinguishable from previous Guo and the later Guo, to a trans-dynastic entity that was China, Hua or Zhonghua, whose primary other was foreign countries or foreign Guo. This conceptual revolution regarding Guo must be understood in the context of the shock 19th century Qing intellectuals and officials experienced when they were exposed to the very fact that the Earth was a globe with no natural geographical center. The Earth being round, for reasons I hope to explore in the coming years, was not widespread among the Qing reading elite, not to mention the average Qing subjects, until the 1890s. The Anglo-American missionary lawyers who introduced international law to China made great efforts in connecting European civilization expressed in modern international law to Chinese civilization of the spring and autumn period. This intellectual trend contributed to the 100-day reform of 1898 and the rise of radical reformist Confucianism associated with that reform. For the sake of time, I have to skip an existing paradigm, and I hope we will have time to revise these slides during the discussion. Skip. After the dismantling of the old civilization narrative of China that was intimately intertwined with Middle Kingdom or Zhongguo as the center of all under heaven or 天下之中, what would be the alternatives? Now I zoom into one section from chapter 3 and one section from chapter 4 to showcase how the late Qing reformers, Kang Youwei, Liang Qiang, and their followers, and the revolutionaries, Sun Yat-sen, Wang Jingwei, Hu Hanmin, and their followers, joined the forces outside of China to conceptually mother the modern Chinese nation, among those who held understanding of Confucianism and of constitutionalism that was deeply embedded in the maritime world. Let's start on the calendar printed in 1904 by Hugh Lam Jipo, which was a revolutionary newspaper founded by Liu Yuhao, Zhang Yongfu, Tan Chou Lam, Chen Chunan, and Lin Yishun, published in Singapore and used by Sun Yat-sen's Southeast Asian supporters to persuade Sun to come to China's South Sea, right, Nanyang, to raise funds and recruit followers. And this is a poem here. I circle here. How can I bear to see robes and the regalia of the superior country brought to the barbarians? 忍令上国衣冠, 沦于夷狄, or 沦于涂炭, fall to the dust and ashes, depending on the edition. I will talk about that in 1 minute. And then the second one is, let us lead the heroes of the Central Plain to win back our rivers and the mountains. 相率中原豪杰, 还我河山 or 还我山河, depending on the version. Okay, and then this poem was attributed to the Taiping general Shi Dakai in reference to the medieval anti-Jurchen general Yue Fei, and it first appeared in the so-called reformer Liang Qichao's writing in 1902 from 新民丛报. But it was referred to by the anti-Manchu revolutionaries Zhou Rong in his famous pamphlet Revolutionary Army in 1903. And so this appearance in Tunan Jipo was the fourth appearance, right? So my questions are, so what the question I derived from this calendar and especially the quotation, right? And my questions are, first, were the revolutionaries and the reformers really separate groups fighting each other with opposing agendas? That was usually what most people believe to be by the modern scholars, right? And the second question was, what drove Qing, Tam, Lin, Bu, Qing? I will talk in 1 minute, those important New Confucian and the Chinese leader in Singapore, Sun Yat-sen, Liang Qichao, Wang Jingwei, Q1, another new Confucian in Singapore, and others to work across dialect and occupational or even national lines, right, in terms of nationality. For a China-oriented nationalist cause from the foreign land. And the third question is, what did these people want for China, for Chinese? What was the nature, was the Republic of China's constitutional cause that derived from this late Qing debate, late Qing constitutional movement, at least in conception, that was heir to both the reformers and the revolutionaries of the late Qing. So my answer, what drove those who produced this calendar together toward the China-oriented nationalist cause is race. So if we look at the calendar, we see first, here you can see, taking out Guangxu, whose Yuan title, Nianhao, shouldn't be used in China, as Guangxu only temporarily occupied the position of the emperor that belonged to the majestic Han. 占理皇汉地位, you can see here, right? 满清光绪占理皇汉地位. Second, those transnational Chinese wanted a new country for their compatriots, connected with each other through blood, as in 同胞, 国民, or siblings born to the same father. Yes, but they also wanted a republic with the rights of liberty, 自由, exercised by sovereign citizens, 国民, and they wanted independence, 独立. You see here. The nationalist cause reflected in this calendar is far beyond the racial revolution, at least for China at the turn of the 20th century. Ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism were combined in one cause. As Sun Yat-sen summarized in 1912, it was racial revolution, 种族革命, and the political revolution, 政治革命, aiming at equality. And it was started from abroad for good reasons, as all those pursuits amounted to treason in China at the time under a monarchy ruled by a minority group. These aspiring nation builders, Liang and Sun alike, were overseas anti-China forces, 海外反华势力 in the literal sense. In fact, the producers of this newspaper and Sun Yat-sen, they tried to bring on board were all foreign nationals of Chinese descent, legally and culturally. Now let us return to question one. Were the revolutionaries and the reformers really separate groups fighting each other with opposite agendas? Existing scholarship that tries to outline the disagreement between the revolutionaries and the reformers in the last decade of the Qing often focuses on two big debates or battles. The first was in Tokyo between the revolutionary periodical 民报 and the reformist 新民丛报. It took place between 1903 and 1905. And the second was in Southeast Asia between the revolutionary newspaper 中兴日报 Restoration Daily and the reformist one Union Times 总会新报. And it occurred between 1905 and 1907. So, but in 1899, both Qiu Yonghong and Tan Choulan, we discussed the founder of the 29jibo, right? This one, the revolutionary newspaper, and the revolutionary 中兴日报 Restoration Daily were among the 78 Singaporean Chinese leaders who submitted a petition to the Qing government in opposition to the potential disposition of the Guangxu Emperor by the Empress Dowager Cixi. So they were supportive of Guangxu, right? These two people, Qiu and Tam, were also founders of the so-called, the other side, right? The 总会新报. They were also the founder of the Union Times before it was taken over by people closer to Liang Qichao after Liang Qichao broke up with Sun Yat-sen as late as in 1902. Liang Qichao and Sun Yat-sen lived as neighbors in Japan. They collaborated in Tang Caichang's 1900 uprising of the Independent Army or 自立军起义 and the progressive Chinese language Datong school system that spanned from Japan to Southeast Asia to North America. And the reformers and the revolutionaries also worked with each other in Singapore and elsewhere during the 1905 anti-American boycott that was triggered, we discussed in one moment, by a treaty negotiated between the Qing and the United States related to the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. So I'll show you some of the pictures here. This person was Lin Qing. He for those who are familiar with 20th century New Confucianism, Lin Qing was a famous New Confucian, and he was born in British Malaya. And the interesting thing I want to talk about this slide was of course, he was with Qing at time in supporting the Guangxu Emperor. He was working very closely also with the Qing government in the Confucian reform movement in Singapore during the time. And he was working with the so-called reformers for the independent army uprising, right? But he was also a member of, here as shown, the Nanyang or the Southeast Asian branch of the Chinese Revolutionary Alliance. Actually, when Sun Yat-sen became the provisional president of the Republic of China, Lin Qing was his secretary for public health. So you can see these people, who were they, right? They were revolutionaries, reformers, or collaborators with the Qing, right? And on the right, this person was called Wang Naisang. He was the father-in-law of Lin Qing. He was the founder of the today still Chinese Methodist majority community in Cebu. Now today is Eastern Malaysia, right? And he was a Chinese Christian from Fuzhou. He was a Tongnian, or they passed the examination in the same year with Kang Youwei, and he participated in the Gongche petition before the 100-Day Reform, and he joined the 100-Day Reform, and after failure, he sort of like escaped to Southeast Asia and started socialized with the reformers and the revolutionaries there. And he was better known as actually the father-in-law of another very important person, who became famous during COVID. That was Wu Liande, who was supposed to be the designer of the N95 face mask, who was also a British-born Chinese or Chinese a person of Chinese descent with British nationality. And yes, and he, interestingly, of course, you can see he participated in the civil service examination, was part of the 1898 reform, and then he joined the Tongmenghui or Revolutionary Alliance in Nanyang and became revolutionary, donated money and this and that. And then he returned to China, became a consider in the provincial assembly, right, of Fujian. And then, then that means he became a constitutional monarchist. And then when the 1911 revolution broke out, he launched an armed rebellion against the Qing government in Fujian. So who was he, right? Whether he was a reformer, revolutionary, or whatever. There are many details that I won't have time to cover, but in general, the reformers and revolutionaries active during the last decades of the Qing were one group of intellectuals who embedded themselves in the same informational and social network that connected Honolulu with Hong Kong, Singapore with San Francisco, Tokyo with Penang. This network was composed of overseas Chinese, many of whom were of foreign nationalities and of transnational intellectuals who perceived the world through largely imported frameworks. And this was a network foreign to China epistemologically and legally, and often geographically, with Anglo-Chineseness figuring large among all foreign influence. More details to be skipped on how many of these leading figures in these reformist and revolutionary newspapers switched their camps back and forth, and sometimes more than once. This photo on Sun Yat-sen offering sacrifice to the Ming founder as the provisional president of the Republic of China is often used by instructors of modern Chinese history to show the connection between the 1911 revolution and the anti-Qing Ming restorationist movement. I also use this photo in this way, and I discuss the Ming restorationist small swords rebellion with the resources drawn from overseas Chinese and in collaboration with the Taipings during the 1850s in my book. But what I want to show with this photo in this presentation is actually, so this was Sun Yat-sen. He was the head of the Xinzhonghui, or the Revived China Society, composed mostly of Cantonese. And this was Huang Xin, who was probably as important as Sun Yat-sen in this movement, and they had more military presence in the 1911 revolution. He was the head of the Huaxinhui, or China Revival Society, composed mostly of Hunanese, who Huang Xi was also a close friend with Song Jiaoren, who was later the elected premier, assassinated by still today we don't know whom, right? And before Yuan Shikai took over as the self-proclaimed emperor. But who introduced these two people to know each other? Actually, it was Yang Du, who was known to play a very important role in the late Qing Xinzhen or constitutional reform that was sponsored actually by the Qing government. He was a Hunanese. He was very close friend to Liang Qichao. When Liang Du was in Japan, Liang Qichao still had a price on his head. But you can see these people, right? He was supposed to be a constitutional reformer, but these two were the revolutionaries. And actually, these two were introduced to each other by Yang Du at Yang Du's house. So you can see here, I guess some quote from Liang Qichao, and as you said, actually, our Guangxu emperor is really worthy, and everybody knows in this country. And when we have a successful revolution, he can be elected to be the president. That was from 1899, before Liang Qichao and Sun Yat-sen supposedly broke up in 1902. But in 1904, still Liang Qichao said, 治革命更进步. So if we have one step forward for the revolution, and the constitutional monarchy will also have one step forward, because even though these two constitutional forces had different means, what they shared was to the opposition to the current government, right? And of course, these people, regardless of the labels they were assigned to, or the labels they were carrying themselves, were operating in closely knitted circles. And the reformers and the revolutionaries quickly reconciled with each other after the 1911 revolution, with the constitutionalist Yang Du and Sun's close follower Wang Jingwei jointly issued a declaration for the constitutional pursuit of both so-called parties, 党, right, 革命党, 立宪党. And Yang was in Beijing as part of the National Assembly of the Qing, while Wang was just released from incarceration due to his failed attempted assassination of the Qing regent, Taifeng. The question too, right? What drove Liu Junhao, Tan Chaolin, Sun Yat-sen, and others to work across dialectic lines, right? They spoke different languages, and the Cantonese, Fuzhouhua, right? Hokkien, Fujianhua, etc., and also overcome the so-called migration corridors for a China-oriented nationalist cause. That was, in the words of Philippe, right? These dialect groups often coincided with the occupational groups. So this that often connected these different dialect groups closer to their qiaoxiang, to the home regions, rather than to China as a whole, right? Why, and how did they overcome these lands? And many of them belong to different empires, so they carry different basically nationalities, right? So what happened? And of course, it was race. At the turn of the 20th century, transnational Chinese were brought together, and for overseas Chinese experienced synicization or reorienting toward China due to their collective exclusion against the backdrop of legalized social Darwinism that quickly spread around the world. And for example, this was a Malay-Chinese symbol, and in this newspaper, an author complained that if it develops like this, then one day we Chinese will have no place to set our foot, even though there are plenty of land in the world. So what happened, right? Most people are familiar with the Anti-Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, right? But at the same time, and then 2 years later, the Mandatory Act of 1884 was passed in the United States. Why, there was this a mandatory act? Because there was a debate, once there was an 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act that banned the immigration and for the laborers to enter United States and US territories. And the issue was whether a person like Lin Qing, who was of the Chinese race, right, who was of the British nationality, would be counted as Chinese, would be subject to this law. And eventually in 1884, it was decided that the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act should be applied to all Chinese, whether subjects of China or any other power. So it was all about race. But at the same time, it wasn't about yellow versus so-called black or so-called white, etc. Because this was related until 1924, when the United States passed the Anti-Asian Immigration Act. It was related to one's country of origin. So, for example, during this period, after the Russo-Japanese War, and especially in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the Japanese were treated not as foreign Orientals like the Chinese in the Dutch East Indies, but as Europeans. So the funny thing about that was once Taiwan was taken over by Japan, and the Japanese, because they were Europeans, so the Taiwanese became the Japanese subjects. They became the even of the Chinese residents. And then there were people who forged their registration with Taiwan because they wanted the Japanese subject status so that they have more freedom to do business and they could send their children to the European schools in Dutch East Indies. So you can see that, yeah, it was race-based, but it was not the race in terms of, white or yellow. It's not the Pan-Asianist sense, right? And that was a later development. That the race was related to one's country of origin. That means these people like Sun Yat-sen, Lim Bu-king, it was reasonable for them to believe that if China was brought in line with Western European, Euro-American civilization so-called standard, they would be able to treat it as the Europeans, like the Japanese, right? And in 1902, this Chinese Exclusion Act and the definition of race related to one's culture of origin started to be applied to the newly annexed Hawaii and the Philippines, with especially for Hawaii, with a quite large Chinese population there. And of course, there was a white Australian policy, etc., etc. So the whole 1905 anti-American boycott was a diaspora moment that was related to this, race-based Chinese exclusion law that was made permanent in 1902, right? Because the 1882 law was supposed to be renewed every 10 years, and in 1902 it was made permanent. And then the Qing government raised opposition, this and that. So that eventually led to the global-wide 1905 anti-American boycott by ethnic Chinese all over the world. Okay, and the third question was, what did these people, right, Kang Youwei, Liang Qizhao, Sun Yat-sen, Tim Hawk, Tan Chou-Len, Wang Jingwei, Qiu Suwan, etc., what did they want for China and for the Chinese, and what was the nature of the Republic of China's constitutional cause, at least in conception, that was an heir to both the reformers and the revolutionaries of the late Qing. For the sake of time, I won't delve into details about the comparison I offer in the book. That shows the similarity between the reformers and revolutionaries in their Tokyo-based and Southeast Asia-based debates. I just gave a very brief summary here with some quotes, and I will explain the common ethno-civic cause they were pursuing while you read the course. The first is what they wanted, right? The first is the xenocentric, multi-ethnic nation that was racially inclusive but culturally assimilationist. Right. And the Kang Youwei said, many people assume like Kang Youwei, Liang Qizhao, they were more supportive of the Manchus. In what way? Right. The Kang Youwei said, like, Guangxu Emperor promised to delay the categories of the Manchu and Han. And Kang Youwei said that, the Manchus were already Sinicized, so we don't worry about them. Because at that point, like actually in the first decade of the Qing already lifted the marriage bar between the Manchu and the Han, right? So the Manchus were already assimilated, and Kang Youwei just wanted the others, the Mongols, the Uyghurs, to be brought in line with this, with the Chinese line, right? 教已经是 teach them the Confucian classics, the language, and the customs. So eventually they would be merged into the central line, right? That was truly great uniformity, not great harmony, right? 大同 in the literal sense, uniformity, 同. Right. For Liang Qizhao, he said, of course, we want the greater nationalism, but it must be centered on the Han, right? And the organization must be arranged by the Han. It's just inevitable, right? And the Wang Jingwei, they were very, very radical people, like the 周荣, right, said like, 杀杀杀, we kill them all. But most people like Wang Jingwei, Cai Yuanpei, Sun Yat-sen, they were not radical anti-Manchu people. Wang Jingwei, on behalf of the Sun Yat-sen, he said, oh, if the Manchus didn't want to assimilate, they could go back to their home place in Changbaishan or northeastern China or Manchuria. But they're welcome to stay and assimilate, right? And Sun Yat-sen was a promoter of the American so-called ethnic policy of the melting pot all the way until very near to his death in the 1920s. And then second, they wanted constitutional, both parties, reformers and revolutionaries. They wanted constitutionalism with active civic participation, but only after a period of tutelage of some sort. Not necessarily tutelage as defined by the Nationalist Party later, Xunzheng, right? But basically, the people were not ready, right? And even later, when Yuan Shikai claimed that he wanted to be, or he would assume the throne, he said that our people are not ready, right? Kang Youwei said that this was sort of like consensus among those people during this period. Kang Youwei said, "Oh, we have absolute monarchism, we have constitutional monarchy, and we have constitutional democracy. We have to follow this order, right? If we don't follow the order, we'll have chaos. And France already suffered that. And now it's a transitional time. We must do the transitional things, right? And for many people probably know that it's related to his understanding of Confucian classics and the Gongyang Xue, all the ages would evolve from the age of disorder to the age of emerging peace, and then eventually to the age of great peace. And Liang Qichao said, why we need to follow order rather than give people democracy now? Because our people's ability to self-govern have been destroyed by these thousands of years of authoritarianism. So we need a time to cultivate people's capacity, right? And before constitutionalism, not to mention republicanism, could be implemented successfully. And Wang Jingwei was talking about the Sun Yat-sen so-called 生君之约法, or the Sun Yat-sen's arrangement, right? And even though they wanted republic, but after the republic, there was no immediate constitutional democracy. Rather, the revolution was divided into three phases. The first was military rule, or 军法之治, or 军政, which would put all citizens under military government. And the second would last for 6 years of special arrangement. It's called 约法之治, or 训政, during which the military government would grant local self-governance to the people, but monopolize nationwide state affairs. And third is a constitutional rule, 宪法之治, during which the military government would surrender its power and state institutions would govern state affairs according to the constitution. The tutelage was not something the Nationalist Party developed under Soviet influence during the 1920s. It was a natural expression of the three-stage revolution that was developed by the leaders of the 1911 revolution well before the fall of the Qing, based on an understanding that they shared with the reformers. The Chinese people needed time to learn to become citizens, but they would become full-fledged citizens after the transitional period. As Liang Qichao insisted, whoever said that he did not think the Chinese people had the capacity to govern themselves was not engaging in a serious debate, as Liang only thought the Chinese people of the present time did not have the capacity to govern themselves. And then third, right, both parties, or the reformers and revolutions, they wanted socialism. And they disagreed over whether the socialism would be implemented in the immediate future or in the distant future. For example, Liang Qichao said, oh, state ownership of capital and land was a good thing and the most noble and wonderful system of the world in the future. But China of the present day should prioritize the efficiency in production over fair distribution. And Hu Hanmin, on behalf of the Sun Yat-sen, talk about, state ownership of all land. The government purchase that was, what the Taiwan was able to carry out after the Republic of China's government was relocated to Taiwan after 1949. And then Henry George's, the single tax system. And Sun Yat-sen was a follower of the American socialist Henry George from his youth, right? And then when we talk about the equal distribution of the right to use the land among farmers, limiting the development of private capital without abolishing private property, and eventually state ownership of enterprises in such fields as transportation, banking, electricity, postal office, and food and tobacco industry. That was before the fall of the Qing, right? So if you look at the later development and the socialism of Sun Yat-sen's design, it was pretty much the Henry George style American leftist thought. Interestingly, neither the revolutionaries nor the reformers discussed socialism in their words in Nanyang or in Southeast Asia. Why? Because their supporters in Southeast Asia were usually big merchants who made a lot of money through the global trade, and then use that money, they support their families in China to purchase land. So they were businessmen and they were their families were landlords in China. So both parties had the tacit agreement that in Southeast Asia, we are not talking about socialism. The three principles of the people became the two principles of the people in Southeast Asia. And of course, that was Swiss socialism right now, the socialism, not Marxist version, but the social democratic version. For the sake of time, I won't be able to explicate with quotes, but there are three basic points I'm making with the images. First, Sun Yat-sen was a socialist, an American socialist, not a Marxist. He was a follower of the American socialist Henry George for years, and in the 1924 last version of three principles of the people, he was citing obscure American socialist Morris Williams extensively to debunk Marx, especially Marx's theory of class struggle. Second, the big image on the right shows how the blue sky, white, the red earth flag was designed in Singapore, embroidered by the Peranakan woman or the mixed, Chinese Malay woman, Chen Shuzi. But if we look at the left two, the designs that were not adopted, their origin in the American flag was for everybody to see. Third, Sun Yat-sen said many times his pursuit was liberty, equality, fraternity, or of the people, by the people, and for the people. Some of them were carefully obliterated in the 1981 Zhonghua Shuji version of Sun's complete writings, but the newspapers were still there, right? Even in the database produced in mainland. This book decenters China in a variety of ways. To use an example from this presentation, a China-centric approach toward modern Chinese history would treat Sun Yat-sen as China's Guofu, whatever that means, and would treat Sun Yat-sen as a Chinese. What I try to highlight here is Sun Yat-sen being an ethnic Chinese Hawaiian who spent his most receptive years as a teenager in the two Christian mission schools under a constitutional monarchy. In fact, Sun survived the Qing persecution, partially thanks to his Hawaiian citizenship and thus later U.S. citizenship. Sun successfully claimed this citizenship status only after prolonged legal battle he won over the U.S. State Department. If we look at the statue of Sun Yat-sen at Aolani School in Honolulu, from which Sun graduated in 1882, his portrait today still right in the statue as this young boy with an open face and an open heart. Sun Yat-sen won a prize of English language writing at the school and was deeply influenced by American-style constitutionalism that he was unable to get rid of until the very last years of his life, despite his working relationship with the Soviets. As Sun's biographer, Marie-Claire Berger, notes, Sun Yat-sen was, quote, a pure product of maritime China, the China of the coastal provinces and overseas communities, open to foreign influence, end quote. Sun Yat-sen was not alone. We discussed Tu Hawk and Tan Chong Lam, who founded the reformist and the so-called reformist and revolutionary newspapers in Singapore earlier in this presentation. They were typical Peranakans or Anglo-Chinese whose life and business were deeply rooted in British Empire in Asia. Okay, and then King, right? And King, we sort of mentioned him as a reformer and revolutionary. He was actually a Renaissance Peranakan Chinese trained at the University of Edinburgh to become a physician. He later became the president of Xiamen University in 1926 and served there for more than 1 decade. He relied on the interpreter to argue with Lu Xun, whom Xiamen University just hired to teach Chinese literature. And Lin King used the money he earned as a physician or Western medical doctor to support the operation of Xiamen University, of which he was president, right? And due to his limited ability to speak Mandarin, despite his translation of many Chinese classics, Lim had to hire an interpreter to argue with the former medical student Lu Xun. And by the way, the university students at the time overwhelmingly supported Lu Xun, right? And Lu Xun accused, during the debate, Lu Xun accused Lin King as a Chinese of British nationality who cannot open or shut his mouth without the word Confucius, right? Even Liang Qichao, who was regarded as more deeply embedded in Chinese intellectual and social traditions than Sun Yat-sen, was a product of Sino-Western hybridity. At the receptive age of 17, Liang Qichao was persuaded by Kang Youwei to leave behind so-called, in his words, 数百年无有之旧学, useless old learning of hundreds of years old, and to adopt Kang's eclectic thought, which Kang developed over the 1880s during Kang's own 20s and 30s through integrating his classical education, new text Confucianism, and translated Western works. Equally importantly, Liang accepted the line of reasoning promoted by Anglo-American missionaries like Timothy Richard, Li Timotai, and W.A.P. Martin, Ding Weiliang, who emphasized the commonality between Asian Confucianism and modern Western civilization. While Liang Qichao deeply engaged German and Japanese constitutionalism later in his life, during the height of Liang's influence between 1898 and 1903, he was carrying the baggage of the influence he received by these Anglo-American missionary lawyers who spread the rosy understanding of Western civilization for religious purposes. It was the idealistic Liang Qichao who was unable to read Japanese, not to mention German, that set the tone and the stage for political debates at the turn of the 20th century. After Liang Qichao turned to German statism following his so-called conservative turn in 1903, Sun Yat-sen, Wang Jiwei, and others started to use earlier Liang Qichao to fight against later Liang Qichao. That was not to mention that Liang Qichao himself returned to a more civic, less statist, anti-positivist socialist version of nationalism over the 1910s and 1920s under British Labour and the German socialist democratic social democratic influence Liang received by his student Zhang Junmai. This leads to the 1946 Republic of China Constitution, still in effect in Taiwan today. It was drafted by Zhang Junmai or Carson Chang, a new Confucian scholar who was also Liang Qichao's disciple. Traditional historiography often treats the protection of social economic rights of citizens in the 1946 Constitution of the Republic of China as a compromise the nationalists were forced to make with the communists. Zhang Junmai, the drafter, is regarded as a compromise candidate, acceptable to both the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party due to his status as a third force Democrat. But it is also important to take seriously Zhang Junmai's own claim in the Constitution that the Republic of China, being based on Sun Yat-sen's 3 principles of the people, aspired to be a democratic republic of the people, by the people, and for the people. Zhang Junmai's new Confucianism, his training under British and German social democrats, and his conversion in 1945 to Jeffersonianism made him a perfect candidate to give a constitutional interpretation to Sun's 3 principles, which Sun Yat-sen himself claimed to be Lincolnism. Didn't Sun work out these 3 principles in the Tohyo and the Nanyang debates with the so-called reformers in the shared pursuit of a racially inclusive, ethnically assimilationist, politically liberal, and non-Marxist socialist nation, among a group of people who also believed Confucianism to be universal value, compatible with and complementary to modern Western civilization. This was a pursuit Sun Yat-sen shared with Liang Qichao, and this was a pursuit Zhang Junmai shared with his mentor, Liang Qichao as well. The 1946 Constitution was a great convergence between modern Confucianism and Anglo-American constitutionalism. On a related note, the 1946 Constitution was passed by a constitutional body that embraced delegates from Taiwan, which was just returned to the Republic of China after the end of World War II, and embraced overseas Chinese delegates who were legally Chinese citizens according to the use sanguineous principle of the Republic of China nationality law. The People's Republic of China that replaced the Republic of China in mainland China in 1949 would refuse to recognize citizenship status of overseas Chinese who were not born in China. A great convergence in 1946 was overshadowed by an impending great divergence between two Chinas, between two visions for China, and between China and overseas Chinese. This maritime-inspired cause of the late Qing and the Republic of China was not deeply embedded in China's social and political soils. It failed to deliver its promise in mainland China and was replaced by the communists who were, in Ye Wenxin's words, middle county radicals, more deeply rooted in China's agrarian heartland. When discussing civilizational narrative and a constitutional order, 1949 marked a divergence between two visions for China that once coexisted in China before 1949. One vision was Confucius plus Lincoln that we have discussed so far, and which failed in mainland China. It can be found today in some variations in Taiwan, where the Republic of China was relocated after 1949. The triumphant one in mainland China, however, was a combination of anti-Confucianism and legalism under a Leninist party that did have a Leninist goal. Chapter 6 focuses on the Maoist class nation as a constitutional arrangement. In Mao Zedong's own words, that they integrated the traditional Chinese legalism with Marxism-Leninism. Returned together to China with legalist statism was the equation between Guo and the regime that ruled over China. 1949 was and still is referred to China as a founding moment, and between the People's Republic of China and its communist cause was still defined in China as national betrayal, such as, of course, how Liu Shaoqi was attacked during the Cultural Revolution because he supported 1948 movie on 100-day reform, and he was supposed to have said that actually the movie and Guangxu Emperor was patriotic, and then the height of attack on Liu Shaoqi was this Qibei essay saying that it was actually national betrayal. It's not patriotism, because what Guangxu and Liu Shaoqi loved was not the great socialist China and the leadership of Mao Zedong. So it was a national betrayal. But go. I will need to skip the next few slides as they mainly concern storyline 1, and the meaning of Guo and the relationship between state and the people. Skip. Chapter 7 studies the ways in which patriotism in contemporary China manifests itself after the People's Republic of China abandoned the politically defined class nation in the post-Cold War world. My second favorite quote, and this is my second favorite quote from President Xi Jinping describing the people as rivers and mountains, right, as an object. It's regrettable that we won't be able to expand on this. 人民就是江山，江山就是人民。The last section of the last chapter on 正统 orthodoxy and cross-strait relations wraps up this book by returning to the issue of orthodox transmission of political power, or 正统传承 in Chinese history, discussed in the first two sections of chapter 1. Vertically, storyline 1 ends with the continued relevance of traditional Chinese political thought in contemporary Chinese politics. The Communist Revolution being a partial restoration, coming of full circle, as the word revolution literally means. It was the very fact that this was the very fate that the reformers and revolutionaries alike warned against in the late Qing debates. Horizontally, storyline 2 leaves a big question mark and unresolved tensions between the two visions of China and of Chineseness in the ethno-cultural sense, Hua, if not always in the political, geographical sense, 中国. In any case, thank you so much for bearing with me. I look forward to the discussions, comments, and the conversation.
Thank you, Professor Mara, for that very insightful presentation. Now let's move to the discussion session. Our discussants will each give their comments first. After that, Professor Mara will reply to each comment in turn. Let me briefly introduce our first discussant. We have Professor Fan Xin, who is Vice Dean at the Institute of Humanities at Shanghai Tech University. He is a historian of modern China and the world, and the author of World History and the National Identity in China, the 20th Century, and Global History in China. He is also the co-editor of Receptions of Greek and Roman Antiquity in East Asia and the Sage Handbook of Interpreting Chinese History. I now invite Professor Fan Xin to begin.
Thank you very much, Siyu, for the kind introduction. And also thank you very much for the kind invitation from Paul. And Mara, this is a great presentation. I'm a little bit jealous that you have done so much research in the past few years, may I say maybe a decade. It's not an easy topic, and it's also a very important topic. It looks like that you're handling this topic really well. But I guess what I'm trying to say here is for the people who are not in the field, you should understand that this is a very, very controversial issue. The meaning of China within the general scholarship, there has lots of debate. So it's very brave and ambitious for Mara to engage with this topic. But I think the work is brilliant. You have done an excellent job. And it's, from my point of view, you're trying to handling this topic from, well, based on this presentation, maybe from three dimensions. One is the perspective of time. It looks like you're trying to offer a historically informed discussion on the meaning and perhaps also the negotiation of China, right? 国家, the concept of 国家 within the political discourse over the course of the long 20th century. And the second is not only you're dealing with the question of China by focusing on the political discourse, but also you're taking the conversation to another level. That is, you try to de-center the conversation from China to the world in the global. So particularly interesting here is you are introducing the perspective from Southeast Asia, from Chinese diaspora, the overseas Chinese, and you're trying to take another perspective on these very famous people that are well known in Chinese intellectual history, but you're trying to make a spin on them, right? You're bringing their perspective, global perspective. So this is wonderful work. It's a great contribution. And the last on the list, but not least, I think the perspective of law, the idea of constitution, the idea of globally defined meaning, right, from the terms of legality is also very productive. So congratulations on the wonderful job. My job is not just congratulating how wonderful you have been working on this project. I think it is also my responsibility to perhaps bring up a few questions. These questions are for me, but I think it's also, in a way, perhaps will be inducive, right, in the bigger conversation because you only have limited time to deliver such a wonderful, very rich project. So maybe I hope these questions will help you to further deliver some meaningful outcome of your research. The first question is within the dimension of the historical. You talk about the meaning of 国家, And primarily, you're dealing with the conversation from the perspective of the long 20th century, if this is my understanding. But then I wonder, because you were educated at the Peking University, Beijing 大学, and one of your professors has been writing, Professor Deng Xiaonan, and she argues that 国家, at least, well, maybe in the Han Dynasty later part, and maybe even in the early Song Dynasty, 国家 actually meant the emperor, not the nation, not the country, not even the empire. So I wonder, one, from what moment on, right, did the meaning of 国家 gain the meaning of country from this long-term perspective in history? So this is my first question. And the second question is, I really like the global approach in this project. I really like the perspective coming from Southeast Asia, coming from America. But then I wonder, how do we handle the global maybe a little bit more carefully? I guess my question for you here is, you talk about American influence a lot. But then if you look at the late 19th century and the early 20th century, who was the real dominating power in the world? Was it America? And how about Britain? And especially when you are looking at Southeast Asia, it was literally under the colonial jurisdiction of the British Empire. And we also know that Sun Yat-sen was kidnapped in London, and then he was forced to stay in the UK for a longer period of time, where he actually interacted with a lot of British thinkers, and he was influenced by British ideas. And in this conversation, you're talking about Anglo-American as a whole, but don't forget that America is a republic, but Britain is a constitutional monarchy. So I wonder if we can maybe spin on the question of the globe a little bit more. Maybe we take a look at the global from a more nuanced perspective. And what else can we bring in from this global? And the last issue, I think the perspective of constitution, law, legal ideas are very, very important. And maybe this is the most productive part of this book project. And maybe I can ask a small question within this big umbrella. That is, you talk about the law, and you talk about international law. And you also, it seems there's a lot of conversation about whether or not Sun Yat-sen was Chinese, or is he Chinese, or how do we understand Lin Bong Qing, right? All these people. But then I wonder, how about the nationality law, right, within the context of the rise of modern China? Because from my understanding, until maybe early 1950s, right, the Chinese citizenship was defined by blood, right, not by. So I guess my question for you is, when you're dealing with these issues, right, how do we make sense of these overseas Chinese? And there's a conversation that they are not Chinese, maybe legally speaking, but also potentially you're looking at the world when the understanding of nationality was quite different from China today. So I wonder, how do you reconcile this question, this issue? Well, again, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. I have learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for Professor Fanshen's comment. Our last discussant is Philippe Major. He is a lecturer in Chinese philosophy at Lancaster University. He holds a PhD in philosophy from National University of Singapore and a Ma in history from National Taiwan University. He is the author of Confucian Iconoclasm, Textual Authority, Modern Confucianism, and the Politics of Anti-Tradition in Republican China. and the co-editor of Tao Companion to Liang Shumin's philosophy. Please welcome.
Okay, thank you very much, Siyu. Thank you also, Paul, for the invitation. Thank you, Mara, for this talk, which was very stimulating. There's so much work that went into this, and we can really see that. There's so much content in there. It's really impressive. There's a lot that I liked about the presentation, and I look forward to reading the book. I like this idea of rethinking China through these intellectuals who are often outside of the sort of Chinese imperial setting, in a sense. And also, you're rethinking these actors who are relatively peripheral if you're thinking in terms of the centrality of Zhongguo, but you're focusing on the centrality of these actors and thinking about what Zhongguo actually means. So that's I think one fascinating dimension of the work that you're doing. Another one is really just the opening up of the various meanings of Zhongguo, no? That's also something that I think is very relevant for today in a world where there are various actors who are trying to monopolize the meaning of what China is. Certainly, we can think of political actors doing so, often trying to define China in terms of the political side of things, while in fact, you have throughout the 20th century, and Republican China is a fascinating example of that. You have very, very divergent views as to what China means. So I think it's fascinating that you're highlighting these different meanings here. I'm not sure I have very cogent sort of comments and questions. I'll try to make sense of my questions as I go along. So please bear with me if I don't make a lot of sense. My first question would be related to the question of ethno-civic nationalism that you mentioned, and that you build in contrast to state-centric nationalism of the CCP, for example, or in Chinese history also a sort of imperial polity-centric understanding of Guo and nationalism. Now, I see the civic dimension of what you discuss here, the emphasis on the people, on also this idea of a shared understanding of political values as central to the nationalism of the intellectuals that you discuss. I wanted to ask a bit more about the ethno dimension of this, if you could say a few more words about this, especially that you highlighted that some of these intellectuals highlight the sort of multi-ethnic composition of China. And if that's the case, the sort of melting pot also of China, etc. And if that's the case, then what would you mean here by an ethnic form of nationalism? My understanding is that it's an ethnic form of nationalism that is very cultural, but I want to make sense. I want to make sure that I'm right on this. So an ethnic form of culturalism that would be centered very much on an understanding of Chinese culture as rooted in Confucianism, for example, in many of these actors. But if that's the case, then what would be the status of the Shaoshu Minzu in that of the sort of ethnic minorities in China in that conception of nationalism in these intellectuals? Yeah. So that would be, I guess, one question about ethno-civic nationalism. In what sense is it ethnic as opposed to just being cultural on the one hand? Another would be a question about, what are the alternatives out there to ethno-civic nationalism? So you mentioned state nationalism certainly as one of them. I think there are really a plurality of nationalisms that are emerging in the Republican period, a plurality of understanding of what China means. One of them is just a cultural understanding of China that is less rooted in an ethnic definition of what China is, less rooted also in a state definition of what China is. You have that certainly in a lot of the modern Confucians. And then you have others, I think, who have just a purely civic understanding of nationalism. I'm thinking of Chen Duxiu before his conversion to communism, for example, who seems to be committed to China as a civic identity, but certainly not as a cultural one, given how iconoclastic he is. And if that's the case, yeah, I guess why focus on these two different forms of nationalism, no, ethnic civic on the one hand, and on the other hand, the state nationalism, I guess would be my question. I'm not sure if I'm running out of time already. I didn't quite keep track of time, but I guess another question, if I have the time, very quickly, would be about the sort of status of the intellectual in all of this, no? So your work focuses very much on intellectual history, as you mentioned, and it focuses on the role of intellectuals in rethinking China. How do you see, yeah, the role of intellectuals in that period in terms of their relation to politics, I guess would be one big question to ask, no? In terms of legitimizing the need to focus on these intellectuals also, do they represent sort of broad, sort of shared perspectives in China as to what China is on the one hand? So that could be one reason why you would want to focus on intellectuals, meaning that they're just expressing popular views. I'm not fully convinced on that, but that could be one position. Or another one would be that, intellectuals still have a strong political influence, political role in the Republican period, and that's why it is also useful to look at them. And if that's the case, then I guess another question would be whether you think of the intellectual as a figure that becomes gradually alienated also from the centers of power. Not all intellectuals, you have people like Zhang Junmai, who is both an intellectual and a politician. You have plenty of those. But you also have a gradual alienation of the intellectual from the centers of power throughout the Republican period. So if you would agree with this, then how does that play in your reading of the importance of looking at intellectuals when it comes to defining what China means? And then I'm also very much fascinated at this idea of focusing on these relative outsiders, let's say, these actors who are at the periphery of the empire, looking in and having this new understanding of what China might mean. And you highlighted a few dimensions of why these actors might have had such, a new understanding of China. One of them being foreign influences. Perhaps you mentioned also perhaps their positionality as also influencing their views. And that makes a lot of sense to me, in a sense that it might just be when you're outside the empire that you're able to see the empire as a unity in a way that is a bit harder, perhaps, when you're inside and you identify with more local settings. I wondered if that was part of the argument, if positionality also plays an important role. Well, I guess it does, but maybe you could say a few more words about that. Yeah, sorry, I think I spoke a bit too much. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Please allow me to introduce our last discussant. Anna Irene Baka is senior lecturer at the Faculty of Law of Charles University, affiliated with the Institute for the Interregional Study of Constitutionalism and contributing to the ERC-funded Reconcile project on identity constitutionalism. Her work focuses on comparative legal philosophy and explores how different philosophical traditions approach questions of justice and legitimacy. She previously led the EU-funded project, The Right in Human Rights, Aristotelianism and Confucianism at the basis of the EU-China dialogue at Harvard University and Ca' Foscari University of Venice. and she holds a PhD in law from the University of Hong Kong, an LLM from the Free University of Brussels, and an LLB from the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens. And her recent books include Self-Determination Beyond Liberal Legalism, and she has a forthcoming monograph on Aristotle and the foundations of rights. Please welcome.
Thank you very much, Siyu. I would like to thank Mara for her wonderful presentation. This is an excellent work. I consider it really of the highest quality. And I really think it's very courageous what Mara, what you have done with this book. Because I can see not only a history of ideas here, I can also see a kind of a legal and political anthropology as well. And I think this is really important if we really want to, deal with the issues that you're dealing with in this book. So, I mean, I will, as you said, I'm basically a lawyer. However, I have looked into the history of legal ideas quite a lot. I found really fascinating. I think everybody mentioned so far how you dealt with the reception of Western ideas, particularly in maritime China, which is the coastal and overseas, basically Chinese, and how they perceived how ideas, Western concepts were translated and imported. I think, well, in my own work, I basically did some research on the Chinese reception of human rights. And I happened to examine figures such as Liang Qichai, Zhang Zhengmei, and how they translated the Chunli into Chinese in legal and political theory. I think it is really interesting because the Chinese basically followed actually a German, Rudolf Rohring, which we could say that also expresses the mainstream positivist view that sees human rights as basically protected interests. I wonder how you, I mean, if we take it a little bit methodologically, how, I mean, you approached this question of the translation and importation of Western concepts and how they were, let's say, transposed in China. I mean, in my case, for instance, I use the philosophy of Paul Ricoeur, and I argue that there is something in the importation that keeps the original part of the original message, but also it changes it substantially in a way that it also fits the indigenous reception. So that would be, let's say, a methodological question out of curiosity. Another question that I don't think comes from your presentation directly, because I also read your introduction, and you say that there is in the Middle Ages a kind of rise of an ethnic consciousness in China that moves beyond the state-centric notion of Guo. And I found it really fascinating. And I have a question for you, because at the same time, there was the rise of Neo-Confucianism, which you see. And because before that, we know that in the ancient times, imperial China, there was no, let's say, unified Confucian doctrine. But with Juxi, then we have a unification. And Confucianism became a unified doctrine. And I wonder whether this, kind of ideological shift had also to do with what you say about the ethnic consciousness. And finally, I'm talking as a lawyer here. When we talk about constitutionalism in law, we connect it to the idea also of human rights and the rule of law. I mean, constitutionalism has this kind of distinct focus because it is about a constitution that limits the state. And I would I'm very interested how your book approaches this relationship, to the rule of law, also in Republican China and the PRC. Thank you very much, Mara. It was a wonderful presentation.
So thank you so much for these insightful comments. I'll be very quick because we have like 5 minutes. I'll try to respond as many as possible. I don't know how much I can do that. In terms of where the sovereignty lies, like the Professor Fan Xin raised, like I was trained by Professor Deng Xiaonan as a master student. So I think one of the things that really inspired me to think constitutionally, not just for modern China, but also for example, the medieval China, Asian China, was her handling of the weird, basically like what did they mean when they refer to emperor, right? And the whole 祖宗之法. So the minister set the rules for the emperor. So the emperor was not as a person, but as an office. So as an office, you can be perfect. You are supposed to be perfect, this and that. But as a person, you are supposed to be very limited. So I guess it was more like, so there was my next project is called Across Stages. I really want to treat some of the central ideas about where the sovereignty lies and this and that. But I do feel that the entire shift, as Anna said, that I do feel like Song was a very important transitional period, but the entire shift was not complete until the Yuanming transition. So during the Tang, obviously they were appreciative of so-called 社继承 or 国事. That means the loyalty was to the dynastic regime, to the cause, to the dynasty or the regime, rather to the emperor as a whole. So the Song experience, they sort of like they elevated the emperor as the guo, but they actually didn't really give emperor a lot of power. It's basically Juicy said it's all belong to 宰相, right? You just pick the right person, so you don't need to do anything, something like that. But there was a intermarriage between the Mongolian, I guess, the steppe tradition through the Jurchen steppe tradition, and then until the early Ming, I think there was a really clear shift to attaching loyalty to the emperor as a person, not as an office. So I'm trying to figure that out. I think that will take some years, but I think it's very important what actually it means, right? And then the second question was on the global, the nuance difference between the Anglo tradition and the American tradition. I have to admit that first, I'm not an intellectual historian. I really need more time and more space to dive into any of these traditions that Philippe also mentioned, like the Japan, Germany. Oh, Anna also mentioned like Japan, Germany, right, and the British labor, and then the American, and then also for Southeast Asia, as a sort of like melting pot of some sort of all this stuff. Then my book is, you in terms of praise, you say, oh, it's about ambassadors. The problem is it's just too big. Now it's super long. I don't know. Like it's like why I sort of like wrap it up. I was already surprised that I wrapped it up. So I guess it's just I can only hold up certain things, and without being able to dive into many of the details, I hope it logically makes sense because pieces seem to fall together in one direction, but I do feel there are a lot of nuanced differences between different schools, and for each thinker, how they sort of work different schools into their own stuff, and how these different positions of these important thinkers and how they negotiate it. I guess hopefully I will have time, and hopefully there will be more people that take intellectual history seriously in terms of the great trajectory. And I guess that I hope is a start. And then in terms of nationality law, there are at least one chapter equivalent of spread across different chapters in the book to deal with the nationality law. So my entire narrative arc in relation to the maritime China versus the landed agrarian China is actually the Qing to the Republic in terms of nationality law. They really had this ethnic understanding. That means by blood, right? So, and they also embraced the overseas Chinese as part of the nation. And it was reflected in the Constitution, in the way they carry themselves. But it was very different from the PRC. So that's exactly what I want to emphasize, that PRC was not influenced. Probably Ye Fei was the only high-ranking overseas Chinese in the PRC. And these people, even though many of the top leaders, they spent 2 years in France, something like that, but their understanding of the so-called West or whatever constitutional tradition was widely different from this integrated, intimate relationship between the Republic of China people and the overseas Chinese. And then my explanation for why the communists won was exactly represented, symbolized by the Limbu Qing and Lu Xun. That was this overseas Chinese. They were, like in Chinese, we call it 不接地气. So they actually didn't know. And I was so inspired by Philippe's research because they were so very much into Confucian as idea, as abstract idea, but not as historical manifestations. So it was an overseas project. It failed because it was not. It was detached from the reality that was the legalized Confucianism, institutionalized Confucianism, the situation in China. They didn't understand. So that's part of the bigger, but that's exactly what you said, that nationality law was part of the key. And it's not just like the PRC, had this idea that why they denied dual nationality to, overseas Chinese. It's very embedded in this, the way PRC was like, in the birth and the development of the PRC. And then for Philippe, and in terms of the first one, oh yes, ethnic. Yes. So to explain why I chose the ethnic civic, because in the traditional historiography on nationalism studies, not us, like not China studies or East Asian studies, the whole narrative was around it started as a civic nationalism in the French American Revolution, and then it became the ethnic in Eastern Europe, and then it got spread this and that. So it's sort of like I was fighting that thing, and I was trying to argue that for China it was introduced at the same time to serve the same purpose. The opposite was a state-centric nationalism. Of course, all the nationalism were state-centric in one way or the other, but China encountered nationalism at the moment that statism was at its high for various reasons. So China had this very strong legally statist tradition, and it got in touch with nationalism when statism was at its high. So even though there was a very strong ethnic civic component, due to all these circumstances, the nationalism for China was quite statism, and eventually it became more statism as it evolved. So I guess it's more like sometimes we are limited by the previous paradigm we want to find out. So we sort of like we shape our arguments in certain ways. And in terms of the ethnic, I feel that's why I try to argue that previously the narrative was more treated the reformers and the revolutionaries and the communists as either three groups or the nationalists and communists as one group. But what I tried to show in all these fronts was also on ethnic front that the reformers and revolutionaries, they were very similar. They were very assimilationist. They were different from the PRC, like autonomous system. You need to keep your national culture. No, not like that at all. Like even Sun Yat-sen or Liang Zichao, they all thought about the assimilation melting pot. Everybody would be sort of the same. You can keep some accent, like the Chinese culture is Chinese American culture, something like that. But they all believe in the same thing, and the civic cause and something like that. They all spoke the same language. On the top of that, you can have the accent. So it's very different from the PRC model. So they almost all the fronts, except for the Leninist transitional structure for the nationalists, they were similar to the reformers than to the PRC. That's it's on the ethnic front, if that makes sense. And also James Leopold wrote a very long article. I don't need to deal with any of this. Like he's already, so I basically had to cite him. So and for other forms of nationalism, that's why I think this book is not exactly just an intellectual history. For me, I really try to focus on those groups who made up some structural constitutional sense. So if there were certain threads of nationalism that they couldn't even figure out a constitutional system, such as if some of the people really focus on the Han-Semitic cultural Confucianism, they will not be able to deal with this Xinjiang, Mongolia. So it's sort of like it's there, right? And you can argue whatever, but whether you have different forms of government, you need to hold them together in one way or the other. So it's more like constitutional history with a strong emphasis on the intellectuals. And also the intellectuals, I treat the intellectuals very broadly, such as Sun Yat-sen, who was not regarded as an intellectual, and also Jiang Kaishan's way of dealing with Confucianism and New Left movement. I think they were all intellectuals, and I never believed that the intellectuals' roles became undermined in modern China because they never played a role. Like during the Qianlong period, they played probably even smaller role. It's like intellectuals were there, they were influential, but unless we treat the politicians as intellectuals, they were just, I mean, and many years ago when I took the master's course from Professor Luo Zhitian at Beida, and he really emphasized you have Chuan, you have Cheng. So you have to have all sorts of people creating all beautiful thought, but which one became the popular was not determined by these intellectuals. That's why, I think my approach is more, even though it study a lot of intellectuals, but actually it's more social history than intellectual history. And then I'll probably just only have, so sorry. Anna's question on the translation. I think, I focus on the storyline too, but storyline one is all about even a single term like human rights, right? How about rights? 权利, it's like, and then like 逻辑, it's basically when different cultures had to depend on translation for communication. My argument, the entire global history thread was actually people's mutual understanding was very superficial and limited, and through translation. And there were all sorts of baggages and misunderstandings. It's not like it's impossible for people to understand each other, but it's not one time. It's more like I try to use like Andromeda galaxy and our Milky Way. If they merge, it's not word, which is because the language, every language had its own roots and they carried the baggages. So often it happens that two people, for example, you and me, we're supposed to speak the same language, but because we have different mother tongues, we already, every word that carries so that's the storyline that I am unable to focus. But I do feel many of the even the rule of law, right? How to translate that, like 法治. So in China, the whole expression doesn't indicate the rule of law. It can be rule by law or whatever, because it's just a rule, law. So there's no sort of, how to say, the verb that connected to, right? Because of that, you can say like 社会主义法治. It doesn't have to be like, of course, if we translate it as a socialist rule of law, it sounds better. But also Xi Jinping can, very reasonably argue for the Chinese language audience that we have 社会主义法治 because we have socialism and we have law. So that's right. We govern with law. That's why. So I'm not saying that it's all language issue, but sometimes it is language issue, and even with one word is so difficult. How about all this, like the whole system, right? That's what I try to show with this book. And I guess I already run out of my time, but anyway, thank you. And see.
Thank you so much, Mara.
Okay, I think our conference have already exceeds the orange time, but do we have any question from audience? Maybe we can open the floor for. So okay, there's no questions from
There's
audience.
one
There's a question. There's a question.
Why?
There is Lilith.
Sorry, I cannot see the message.
Lilith.
Should I go? I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt the flow. So thanks very much for the sweeping, highly detailed survey. I'm hoping to get a hand on the book soon. I'm a historian of philosophy at the Free University of Amsterdam. And I work explicitly on the philosophy of the Straits Chinese, or the name that the British Malay Chinese called themselves. And I'm actually co-writing a book explicitly focused on the philosophy and politics of Lim Boon King. So I'm very excited that the attention you've paid to him here as a significant political agent here. So I've argued recently that Lim doesn't understand Confucianism as a straightforward revivalism, like the kind that Lucian criticized. So I think they were talking past each other there. But I do second Xin-Fan's point about the importance of the British world hegemony in this context. For example, Lim in his early years expressed that the international order under which China and the quote-unquote celestial empire more broadly would develop, he thought that it would be brought about by British hegemony and civilizational tutelage, right? So that's pretty crucial in terms of the kinds of politics that develops after that. And I think another related question there, I guess maybe you have stuff on this in the book, but how the First World War affected how the Chinese Republicans negotiated between, say, American models of empire and British models of empire. Like, yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. And so Lim Qing, I actually emphasized more of his writings in my book, and I do feel like he was quintessential, this sort of like people not in between but both, right? And he was very supportive of many of the British positions using Confucianism, which was really interesting. And also he also taught that Baba or the Pernacons, like you shouldn't give up on your British nationality. That's exactly our advantage. And the Chinese in China have a lot of prejudices. That's why we need to fix them. That's why I think that some of their courses were more like we have this common pursuit, but this is also to serve us. Right. And that's one of the reasons why it didn't work, because they were so detached. But my feeling was the Second World War was really a very important turning point. I didn't have the space to delve into that. And in my book, I discussed that Zhang Junmai, he was very special. He was trained, he's undergraduate from Japan. Then he spent many years. His PhD was from Germany, I think, and he was very much influenced by the British labor tradition. And but he had a conversion in 1944, 1945 in the United States, invited by the US government to be there. And then later afterwards, so there is an article recently published at the Law History Review by two law professors on the Zhang Junmai's constitutional journey. But I do feel that because the power was tilted so much toward the United States, in the sense that for the nationalist government, first Sun Yat-sen himself was probably just a product of the sort of combined Japanese and American. It's more than Chinese. His Chinese was more like Japanese, Yangming, sort of funny. But anyway, but then the government, it was in its best benefit, or the most reasonable way was actually for them to model the constitution more following the American style. And Zhang Junmai was not like Zhang Junmai converted, so he made it that way. But if Zhang Junmai did not convert, he would not be paid. So basically, it was it's American empire project in terms of economy. Many of the economies trend in the United States and influenced by the United States vision. And also Zhang Junmai was a constitutional candidate. So it's more like sometimes it's about the power. It's not exactly about so from the China side, it's you can see that Sun Yat-sen, the Zhang Junmai, this and that. From the US side, this was part of their broader design for the post-war world. But it didn't work out. But it partially worked out. If we look at, I had an image on the first island line. It's almost like a constitutional line between the American constitutional legal empire and the so-called communist, etc. It's not a coincidence. So in the end, it's sort of like it's constitutional, but if we treat constitution as a global cause, it's also about power, right? Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you to Professor Fan Xin and Philippe and Anna, and also again thank you to Mara for the wonderful talk. So let's stop here due to the time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a great
Thank
evening.
you so much, Mara.
Thank you, Mara. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.